The black roses were dying. Bianca noticed it the moment she stepped outside, her worn leather boots breaking through the thin crust of overnight frost that had spread across the clearing like a second skin. The dark petals had curled inward, each blossom drawing itself closed as though the cold had pressed a thumb against its chest and simply squeezed. Frost clung to the thorned stems in pale silver threads, and the once rich heads had bowed low toward the frozen ground. Most people would have mourned. Bianca merely nodded. Good. They were exactly where they needed to be. She had planted them 3 years ago, 39 bushes in total, arranged in a deliberate arc along the northern and western faces of the cabin. Not for beauty, not for sentiment. She had planted them the way her grandmother had taught her, root deep, cluster tight, and let the earth do what walls alone could not. But no one had asked why. They never did. Bram had called them funeral flowers, his voice carrying that particular weight of contempt men used when they wanted to dismiss something without understanding it. He had said it loudly, on the path to the storage house, loud enough for the other warriors to hear, loud enough for laughter to follow. Elder Tessa had shaken her head with the pity reserved for those who wasted effort on foolish things. And Beta Raph, who had personally arranged for the pack's lowest-ranking Omega to live as far from the settlement's center as the western boundary allowed, had called them a waste. The word had dropped from his mouth like a stone into still water. A waste of effort. A waste of space. A waste. Bianca had said nothing. She had learned long ago that invisible people hear more than those who speak. She pressed her fingertips to the nearest stem now and felt it resist, stiff and unyielding against the cold. Beneath that frost-hardened earth, she knew the roots stretched nearly 5 feet deep, woven together, interlocked, like the fingers of sleeping hands. Every bush she'd planted had been placed precisely, each one anchored to the next through the underground structure her grandmother had shown her on their knees in a different garden, in a different life, before everything had been taken and reassigned. The strongest things are hidden, her grandmother had said, pressing dirt from Bianca's small palms. Roots don't need to be seen to hold. The wind shifted. Bianca raised her eyes toward the mountains. It came down from the peaks in slow, deliberate waves carrying pine resin and ice over stone. The smell of weather that had not yet arrived but was already decided. Sharp, ancient, the kind of cold that moved through the air like a warning rather than a season. She had been waiting for it. Not this exact morning, but this storm, yes. She had known it was coming the way you knew a debt was coming. The signs had been adding up for weeks. The way the ravens had moved south too early. The way the elk near the northern ridge had been feeding in unusual clusters. The way the bark on the older pines had thickened before its time. She looked up at the sky. The clouds sat heavy over the ridge, grey as iron, layered and dense, pressing low over the peaks, with the particular weight she had only ever seen twice before in her life. Both times, roofs had collapsed. Both times, roads had disappeared for weeks. This was not ordinary snow. This was the old kind. The killing kind. Her grandmother had called it the breath of the mountain, the storm that came not to pass, but to settle, to bury, to reclaim. Bianca pulled her cloak tighter across her shoulders and turned back toward the cabin. She stepped through the door into the warmth of the single room, where a fire burned low and measured in the stone hearth. The kind of fire she built to last, not to blaze, not to impress, but to endure. From the rafters hung dried herbs in bound bundles, yarrow and pine bark, elderflower and blood moss, and several others with no common names in Frost Hollow, pressed into her palms by her grandmother when Bianca was barely tall enough to reach the kitchen table. Not all strength is carried in the body, little one, she had said. Some of it lives in what you know. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now let's dive in. Bianca crossed to the window and looked out at the dying roses. She was 23 years old and had lived in this cabin for nearly 3 years. She had been assigned to it, not chosen it, after the ranking ceremonies had placed her at the bottom of every category the elders measured. Speed, strength, aggression, social standing. She had accepted the assignment without argument, without appeal, without the kind of visible grief that would have given Raph satisfaction. She had simply come here, and she had planted. On the wooden table behind her sat 3 leather journals, filled cover to cover with her own careful hand. Wind patterns, animal migrations, structural weaknesses in the settlement's older buildings, avalanche zones above the northern pass, strange movements near the border she had observed from her single eastern window and recorded without knowing, at the time, what they meant. She had told no one. No one had asked. The warning horn sounded an hour later. One long blast, too short. Visitors. Bianca frowned. No one came to Frost Hollow during the first heavy snowfall. The pass was brutal even in clear weather. To ride it with those clouds pressing down from the peaks that was either desperation or power. Those with enough of one rarely needed the other. She moved to the window and watched the distant tree line. 6 riders emerged from the pass, dark shapes against the white, moving in tight formation, disciplined and unhurried despite the cold. And at their center, unmistakable even at this distance, a figure who rode as though the mountain itself had decided to make way for him. The settlement erupted. She could hear it even from here. Voices carrying across the frost. The scramble of boots on packed snow. Servants rushing. Warriors straightening. Beta Raph's voice rising above the rest, sharp with the particular panic of a man who needed to look prepared. No one came to tell Bianca. No one ever did. She had expected nothing, which was why her hand stilled on the window frame when 3 measured knocks sounded against her door. Not frantic, not dismissive. 3 knocks with the weight of someone who had chosen to be here. She opened it. The cold swept in around him like a cloak of its own. He was broader than she'd expected, and quieter. Snow rested across his shoulders like he hadn't thought to shake it free. Ice glittered in his dark hair. His face was unreadable, not cold, exactly, but still in the way that deep water was still. Something moving underneath, invisible from the surface. His silver eyes were not looking at her. They were looking at the roses. He studied them for a long moment, the bowed heads, the frost-laced stems, the careful, deliberate arc of the planting with an attention that no one in 3 years had ever given them. Then his gaze moved to hers. "You planted these?" "Yes." He looked toward the mountains, then back to the dying flowers. "Why?" Bianca answered simply, the way she answered everything, without apology, without performance. "Because I knew the snowstorm was coming." King Moss, the wolf of the north, the man no one had expected, studied her for one long, unreadable moment. Then he asked the question that would change everything. "Explain." She did not invite him inside immediately. That small hesitation, barely a breath, the pause of someone accustomed to traps disguised as opportunities, was not lost on him. Moss had spent enough years reading people to recognize the difference between rudeness and caution. This was caution, the earned kind. "The explanation will take more than a doorway," she said finally. She stepped back. He entered. Behind him, Beta Raph moved to follow, and Moss stopped him with nothing more than a slight turn of his shoulder. "Wait outside." Raph's mouth opened, closed. He stepped back into the snow with the tight, controlled expression of a man who had learned to swallow his objections without letting them show on his face, but not, Moss noted, without letting them show in his eyes. He filed that away. The cabin was small. He registered that first, and then immediately stopped registering it, because every surface was occupied in a way that made the space feel not cramped, but dense with purpose. Herbs hung from the rafters in careful bundles. A low fire burned with the quiet efficiency of something tended by someone who understood heat as a resource rather than a comfort. The wooden table was half covered in folded pages and leather-bound journals, edges worn soft from handling. He did not sit. Neither did she. "The roots," she said, moving to the window, as though the conversation had already been in progress, and she was simply continuing it. "Black roses aren't planted for their appearance. Most people don't know that. They're planted for what they do underground. Decorative flowers with structural function. Everything has structural function," she said, without looking at him. "Most people only ask about the parts they can see." Outside, the first fine curtain of snow had begun to fall, soft, and almost lazy, the kind of beginning that gave no hint of what followed. Moss watched it through the glass and said nothing. She continued. The root systems go deep 5, sometimes 6 feet in ground like this. When they're planted in connected rows, they interweave beneath the soil. That network stabilizes the foundation. Winter ground contracts when it freezes. It expands when it thaws. That expansion is what cracks walls, splits support beams, works the stones in a foundation loose over years. She paused. Unless something is holding the soil still. The roots hold it. The roots hold it. She moved to the table and opened one of the journals without ceremony, not performing the gesture, just using it, and turned it toward him. On the page was a cross-section sketch, hand-drawn with careful precision, the cabin above ground, and beneath it a spreading web of lines, each one labeled. The thorn network above the surface traps, drifting snow, forces it to pack along the exterior walls instead of building pressure on the roof, slows the wind load. During severe storms, the bushes act as anchors. They break the force of the gusts before they reach the structure itself. Moss studied the diagram for a long moment. You designed this. My grandmother taught me the principle. I adapted it for this soil, this elevation, this exposure. She closed the journal. The northern and western faces received the worst of the weather from the pass. That's where I concentrated the planting. 39 bushes. She glanced up. She hadn't expected him to remember that detail. 39, she confirmed. And the other homes in the settlement. It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. Most were built without consideration for the direction of prevailing wind, the northern row especially. The structures are older. The foundations have already been working loose for years. She said it plainly, without satisfaction, the way you stated a fact that had simply refused to stop being true. They won't hold well tonight. The door opened. Raph stepped inside without knocking, snow on his shoulders, an expression arranged into careful neutrality. My king, the riders require direction. The weather is worsening and accommodations in the main hall are being prepared, I'm certain. Moss didn't turn around. Thank you, Raph. The silence that followed had a shape to it. Raph looked at Bianca. Something passed across his face, quick, controlled, and ugly, before his expression smoothed itself back into blankness. He withdrew and pulled the door shut behind him. Moss turned back to the window. The snow was no longer lazy. It came sideways now, driven by a wind that had found its voice somewhere above the ridge and was descending with purpose. The clearing beyond the cabin had already gone white. The dead roses along the cabin wall were bent low and shaking, but their stems did not break. May I remain until it passes? He asked. Bianca looked at him with the particular assessment of someone deciding whether a request meant what it appeared to mean. Then she moved to the hearth and added 2 careful lengths of wood to the fire. Sit, if you like. He sat. And in the hours that followed, the storm arrived in full, and Moss discovered that the cabin's interior was stranger and more extraordinary than he'd first observed. The maps troubled him first. Not pack maps, not territory sketches. These were precise, annotated records of wind patterns across 3 consecutive winters, marked with dates and measurements. Beside them, wildlife journals tracking migration routes, feeding cluster locations, behavioral anomalies. He picked up a smaller notebook filled with structural sketches, not just her own cabin, but every significant building in Frost Hollow. Support beam placement, roof load calculations, foundation depths where she'd been able to determine them. How long did this take you? He asked, turning a page. 3 years is a long time to be quiet, she said. She was preparing something at the fire tea, from the smell of it, though what she'd added to it he couldn't have named. She moved through the small space with the economy of someone who had learned to make herself compact, to take up less room than she was entitled to. He noticed that too. Your grandmother, he said. Tell me about her. Bianca was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind screamed through the pass with genuine violence now, a sound like something enormous moving through the dark. She was a healer, she said, But she taught me that healing isn't only bodies. It's soil, it's weather, it's the spaces between walls. She used to say, a brief pause, something careful moving across her face, that most strength lives where no one thinks to look. Moss set down the notebook. Is that why you don't speak of this? What you know, what you've been documenting. I speak when someone asks. No one has asked. No, she agreed simply. No one has. The fire had burned to a steady, generous warmth. The storm pressed against the walls with a fury that made the windows flex, made the rafters murmur low and wooden above them, and still the cabin held still and solid, rooted against the dark. Then, distantly, through the howl of the wind, came a sound that was neither weather nor wind. A crack, deep, final, the particular sound of something structural, giving way. Bianca set down her cup. The northern houses are next, she said quietly. Moss was already on his feet. He sent 3 riders. They reached the northern row in time barely. The Aldrich family's roof came down 20 minutes after the children were carried out, the central beam splitting clean through under the weight of accumulated snow. By the time the second rider reached the Marin household, the eastern wall had already begun to bow. They evacuated 11 people in the dark, in the storm, guided by a list Bianca had given Moss at the door houses ranked in the order she expected them to fail, with notes on where each family slept and which exits would remain accessible once the drifts rose above the sills. She had written it in under 2 minutes. From memory. Moss stood at the window and watched the distant torchlight moving through the white dark, following her map, and said nothing for a long time. The wind shifted at midnight, exactly when she had said it would. He turned from the window and looked at her. She was sitting at the table, one of her journals open in front of her, making small notations in the margins, updating records in the middle of the disaster she had predicted, because to her it was simply data, and data had to be maintained. She didn't look up when the wind changed direction. She didn't need to. She had already written it down 2 weeks ago. How many families? He asked, when his riders returned before dawn, red-faced from cold, stamping snow from their boots in her doorway. 7 relocated, the first rider said. 2 roofs down. 1 partial collapse on the eastern store. The grain stores? Undamaged. She said to check the drainage channel on the south side. We did. It was blocked. We cleared it. Moss looked at Bianca again. She made another small notation. By morning, the storm had not broken, but it had settled into something steadier, less violent, the kind of cold that committed to staying rather than destroying. The settlement emerged slowly from its night. People dug out doorways and assessed damage, and called to each other across the white distances between structures. And then, the whispers began. Not gossip, not the kind of low murmuring that moved through Frost Hollow when someone had done something shameful or strange. This was different, a hushed, spreading exchange that moved from person to person, the way information moved when it demanded to be shared. It was the Omega at the western cabin. She predicted it. She sent a list. She knew which houses would fail. Bianca heard none of it directly. She was still in her cabin, sleeping for the first time in nearly 18 hours, curled in the chair by the fire, with her knees drawn up and her hands folded beneath her chin, like a child who had decided the floor was too far away. Moss, who had not slept, sat across from her and read 3 of her journals, cover to cover. She woke without startling, that careful, watchful kind of waking that came from years of living alone and needing to know the state of a room before you announced yourself in it. She registered his presence, the fact that he had stayed. The journals open on the table near him. She didn't speak. Neither did he. For a moment. The ranking ceremonies, he said finally. Who evaluated you? Her expression shifted not much, just a degree of careful stillness added to her face. Elder Tessa and the assessment panel. Standard protocol. I ranked last in every physical category. And that determined your housing assignment. It determined everything. She stood, moved to the hearth, built the fire back up with the same measured efficiency as the night before. Speed, strength, aggression. Those were the categories that mattered. I had none of them in sufficient quantity. Therefore, she gestured around her, a small, contained motion. This. Raph arranged the specific location. Her hand stilled briefly on the firewood. He had that authority, yes. Did you protest? She looked at him over her shoulder. The look was not unkind, but it was exact. Protesting requires someone willing to listen, and a ranking of last place is a very effective way of ensuring no one is. Moss was quiet. I tried, early on, she said, turning back to the fire. I brought observations to the council meetings, notes on structural weaknesses, a record I'd kept of unusual weather patterns that winter. A pause. Elder Tessa thanked me for my enthusiasm and suggested I focus on tasks more suited to my abilities. What tasks did she have in mind? Kitchen support, mending, carrying things. The fire caught. She rose and returned to the table. After that, she said simply, I stopped attending meetings. Raph came twice before midday. The first time, he stood in the doorway for 3 minutes, delivering a careful account of the settlement's damage assessment. Speaking to Moss exclusively, his gaze never touching Bianca. His voice had the particular quality of a man performing competence. Organized, thorough, slightly too fast. Moss listened. Asked one question about the grain stores. Raph answered. Left. The second visit was shorter. Some logistical matter about housing the displaced families. Raph's eyes moved once to Bianca's table, to the journals, to the maps, to the evidence spread across the modest surface of what she had been doing out here, while the settlement ignored her, and something crossed his face that was not quite readable, but was definitely not nothing. He left faster that time. Late afternoon, the light through the windows turned a deep, bruised blue. Moss had moved to the table during the hours Bianca slept, and he had not moved away. She worked quietly beside him now, neither of them requiring the other to fill the silence. He had come to understand, across the long span of the previous night, that she was not a quiet person in the way that some people were quiet, not shy, not withholding, not diminished. She was quiet in the way that people were quiet when they had learned that speaking too freely cost things they could not afford to replace. He was reading the third journal when he found the page. He stopped. He turned back, looked again. The margins were dense with her usual notations, but these were different. Not weather, not structural measurements, not migration routes or flood patterns or wind calculations. These were formations, rider positions, supply line notations, movement counts, organized by date, by direction, by interval. The kind of documentation that required knowing what you were looking for, or watching something long enough that the pattern assembled itself, whether you intended it or not. He turned the journal toward her without speaking. She looked at it, then at him. Where did you learn these? He asked. His voice was careful. Still, the stillness of deep water. Bianca held his gaze. I didn't learn them. A beat. I observed them. The words settled into the cabin like smoke. Observed. Moss did not move. He kept the journal open in front of him, his finger resting at the edge of the page, and waited with the particular patience of a man who had learned that silence, applied correctly, was more effective than any question. Bianca reached across and turned back 2 pages. It started 11 months ago, she said. Late autumn. I saw the first riders from the eastern window, 4 of them, moving through the pass before first light. That alone wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the direction. She pointed to a notation in the margin, a date, a compass bearing, and a small symbol she had used to mark the count. They came from the south, but they didn't ride to the settlement. They stopped in the tree line at the base of the second ridge and waited. Waited for what? Someone came out to meet them. She turned another page. I couldn't see faces at that distance, but I could see the meeting was short. Whatever was exchanged information, materials, I don't know, it happened quickly, and then the southern riders left the same way they came. Before the settlement was awake. An hour before, at least. Moss looked at the date again, turned it over in his memory. 11 months ago, he had received the first report from a southern informant, fragmented, unverified, easy to dismiss. He had not dismissed it, but he had not yet found the thread that connected it to anything concrete. "Show me the rest," he said. She showed him. Page by page, the picture assembled itself across the table between them. 7 separate sightings over 11 months, each documented with the same careful precision as her weather records. Dates, times, estimated party sizes, movement directions. On the 4th occasion, she had noted the horse's northern breed, compact and dark, but carrying southern-style saddle rigging, the kind used in the lowland territories below the Karath Range. On the 6th, she had found the tracks herself, on one of her early morning walks along the cabin's perimeter. Wolf tracks, but not wild, too organized, moving in coordinated lines rather than the wandering spread of a hunting pack. She had sketched them, every one. "Hidden camps," she said, opening to a page near the journal's end. A rough terrain map, hand-drawn from memory and observation, with 2 locations marked in the tree line north of the settlement. "I couldn't get close enough to confirm, but the supply deliveries changed around the same period. There were crates being moved through the northern route that weren't logged in the settlement's records. I know because I could see the storage house from here, and I counted." "You counted." "I had time," she said, the same words she'd used the night before. But now Moss heard them differently, not as modesty, not as deflection, but as the plainest possible description of what exile actually was. She had been given nothing but time, and she had turned it into the most comprehensive intelligence record he had seen outside of his own general's reports. He sat back. "There have been rumors," he said carefully, "of organized resistance among the southern packs. Coordinated dissent, possibly something larger." He watched her face. "My people have been trying to trace supply lines for 6 months. Bianca looked at the map she had drawn from her window, from her walks, from 3 years of being the person no one watched because no one thought she mattered. "It's been growing longer than 6 months, she said. He believed her. They worked through the remaining hours of the storm, Moss, cross-referencing her records against what he carried in his own memory. Bianca filling in details with the quiet precision of someone recounting observations rather than building arguments. There was no performance in it. She was not trying to impress him. She was simply reporting what she had seen, in the order she had seen it, with the same detached accuracy she applied to weather and wolves and the structural integrity of aging buildings, which made it more alarming, not less, because she wasn't interpreting. She was only describing, and the shape that emerged from the descriptions was unmistakable. "Sometime after the fire had been rebuilt twice," she said, without particular emphasis, "Raph arranged for me to be placed here specifically." Moss looked up. "I assumed at first that it was ordinary contempt," she said. "Low-ranking Omega, inconvenient, remove her from sight. That's common enough." A brief pause. "But the western boundary is isolated for a reason. It's the only point in the settlement with a direct sight line to the northern pass and the second ridge." She met his eyes. "And I was placed here 2 months before the first riders appeared in that tree line." The fire cracked. Moss said nothing for a long moment. "You're saying he put you here because he knew you would see. I'm saying he put me here because he believed I wouldn't matter enough to report what I saw." She folded her hands on the table. "Which is a different kind of knowing." Morning came in slowly, pale and exhausted, the way mornings came after storms that had spent everything they had on the night. The wind had dropped to something manageable. The snow had eased to scattered flurries, thin and directionless. Frost Hollow emerged from its doors into a world that was white and broken and very quiet, the way places were quiet after something violent had passed through them. Moss stepped outside with Bianca into the cold, clear air. The settlement was visible from her door at this distance, small structures against the white, some standing cleanly, some with damage legible even from here, collapsed sections, caved-in storage roofs, broken fences buried to their crossbars. People moved among the wreckage slowly, assessing, beginning the long process of understanding what had been lost. And then they looked west. One person first, then another. Then a small cluster gathering at the edge of the clearing, staring in the direction of the Omega's cabin at the boundary of the territory, where no one had thought to look and nothing important had been expected to stand. The cabin was almost entirely untouched. The walls were solid. The roof held its load without complaint, and along the northern and western faces, the 39 rose bushes, frozen, bowed, seemingly lifeless, stood rooted in the earth, exactly where they had been planted, having done their work through the long, dark hours, without witness or acknowledgement. People stared. Bianca watched them stare. She didn't say, "I told you." She didn't say anything. She simply stood in her cloak in the thin morning light, with her boots in the snow, and let the evidence speak for itself, which was, Moss was beginning to understand, the only language she had ever trusted. He was about to speak when he saw Raph. The beta was standing at the far edge of the main path, partially obscured by the corner of the gathering hall. He had his back to the crowd. He was speaking in a low, rapid voice to a young rider. Moss didn't recognize one of the settlement's own, not one of his men pressing something small, and folded into the rider's palm. The rider's hand closed around it. Raph's eyes moved once quick, reflexive toward where Moss stood beside Bianca's cabin. Their eyes met across the white distance. Raph went very still. Moss moved before the rider did. He crossed the distance at a pace that was not quite urgent, unhurried enough to avoid alarm, deliberate enough that Raph understood immediately what was happening. The rider, sensing the shift, had already begun to turn away when Moss's voice reached him across the snow. "Stay where you are." The rider stayed. Raph turned to face him with the expression of a man assembling his composure in real time, smoothing the tight lines around his mouth, settling his shoulders, constructing the particular blankness of someone who had nothing to hide and found the suggestion mildly insulting. He had the expression ready by the time Moss reached him. "My king," a measured incline of the head. "I was arranging for a rider to inform the eastern farms of last night's storm. Standard protocol after severe weather. Show me the message." A beat. Barely a breath. But Moss had spent 20 years reading the pauses men left in their sentences. "Of course." Raph held out his hand to the rider, who returned the folded paper with visible relief. Raph opened it, turned it toward Moss. It was exactly what he'd described. Storm notification, property assessment instructions. Moss read it twice, not because the words required it, but because he was watching Raph's face while he pretended to. The paper was too clean, written in advance. Edges too crisp for something drafted in the post-storm morning. Prepared, not composed. "Which farms?" Moss asked. "The Aldrich Holdings. The Fenner property. The Aldrich family evacuated last night. They're in the main hall. A precaution in case some members remained behind. And the Fenner property is northwest," Moss said. "Your rider was pointed east." The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones that had come before it. He conducted the questioning in the gathering hall, away from the open ground where the settlement was still emerging from its doors to assess the night's damage. He kept it contained. 2 of his own riders present, nobody else. Raph sat across a rough-hewn table with his hands folded and his expression held in careful neutrality, and answered each question with the fluency of a man who had rehearsed answers to questions he'd hoped would never be asked. The inconsistencies came slowly. That was the nature of prepared lies. They held under direct pressure and unraveled at the edges, in the small logistical details, the dates that didn't align, the supply records that didn't match the delivery counts. Moss had been doing this long enough to know that you didn't break a man like Raph by confronting the lie directly. You built a wall around it, one question at a time, until the space he had to move in became too small to navigate. He sent for Bianca midway through. She came without hesitation, carrying 2 of her journals, and sat to Moss's left without being asked. Raph's expression, when he saw her, moved through something complicated and landed somewhere that was almost afraid. "The trade route changes," Moss said to her. "Tell me what you recorded." She opened the first journal with the same absence of ceremony she brought to everything. The standard northern supply route runs through the Kareth Pass. 7 months ago it shifted. Deliveries began coming through the lower ridge path instead, longer, less efficient, more difficult in winter. She turned the journal toward the table. The official explanation logged in the settlement records was road damage on the primary route. "And the actual road?" Moss asked. Was passable. I walked it in the same week. Her eyes moved to Raph briefly. Calm. Factual. There was no damage. Moss watched Raph. The supply records themselves, she continued, turning a page. There are 6 entries across 4 months, where the incoming quantities don't match what was logged into the settlement stores. The discrepancy is small each time, not enough to draw attention in any individual record, but across 6 entries it accumulates to a significant volume. Of what? Preserved food, rope, oilskin, tools. She looked up. Practical things, useful for equipping people who needed to move and sustain themselves without drawing from a central supply. The room was quiet. Raph's carefully assembled expression had developed a fracture along the jawline, the particular tightness of a man working very hard at something that was no longer working. And the late-night visitors, Moss said, 4 occasions over 8 months, always arriving after the second watch change, when the patrol overlap creates a gap of approximately 20 minutes in the northern approach. She said it the way she said everything as recorded observation, without accusation, without flourish. I documented the dates. The patrol pattern changed shortly after I began noticing the gap, which suggested someone who knew both the timing and the fact that it had been observed. Moss turned to Raph. Raph said nothing, which was, in its own way, the clearest answer he had given all morning. The formal suspension was brief. Moss stated it plainly. In the gathering hall, before the settlements assembled elders and senior warriors, pending investigation, pending the full examination of supply records and correspondence, pending questions that required answers Raph had so far declined to provide clearly. Raph was removed from authority and confined to his quarters under watch of 2 royal riders. He left the hall with his shoulders straight and his face composed, and said nothing, which told Moss more than protest would have. The hall was very quiet after he was gone. Moss looked at the assembled faces, Elder Tessa, grey and still. Bram, arms crossed, jaw set, staring at a point somewhere between the floor and his own understanding of recent events. The others, varying degrees of stunned and uncertain. His gaze moved to Bianca, standing at the hall's edge, where she had positioned herself without being told to close enough to be consulted, far enough to be dismissed if someone chose to look past her. The way she had always stood, the way she had learned to occupy space in a place that had never offered her any. Elder Tessa looked at her, really looked, perhaps for the first time, then looked away at her own hands, as though they contained something uncomfortable. Bram said nothing, but when Bianca moved toward the door, he stepped aside to let her pass, and the small, silent adjustment of a man who had stopped assuming something carried its own quiet apology. He found her at the cabin. She was checking the rose bushes along the northern face, pressing fingers to stems and roots with the same attentive care she gave everything, assessing what the storm had taken and what had held. He stood for a moment and watched her work before she heard him and straightened. "I leave for the south tomorrow," he said. She absorbed this. The rebellion. It needs to be addressed directly. I've been building evidence from a distance. What you've given me accelerates that. He paused. I'm leaving 2 riders here. They know how to follow orders. They don't know this territory or these people. She turned back to the roses. That isn't a question. No, he said. It isn't. He came around to where she was standing and waited until she looked at him. I'm asking you to guide them. Not as a command. The western boundary isn't under my formal jurisdiction. You live outside the settlement's authority structure by Raph's own arrangement, which means you answer to no one here. A pause. I'm asking because I trust your judgment. Yours specifically. You've known me for 2 days. In 2 days you predicted a storm, saved 7 families, documented an intelligence trail my general spent 6 months failing to find, and identified a traitor the settlement trusted for a decade. He held her gaze. Most people don't do that in a lifetime. She was quiet for a long moment. Her hand rested on one of the frozen stems. You prepared for a storm everyone else ignored, he said. I would be a fool to leave without the person who saw it coming. Something shifted in her face, not softening exactly, but the particular change of a wall that has decided to become a door. "I'll guide your riders," she said finally, "until you return." "Until I return," he agreed. He was almost to his horse when his lead rider met him on the path, face tight with the controlled urgency of bad news being delivered carefully. The man held out a second message, intercepted from the route Raf's rider had actually been taking, recovered from a courier cache 3 miles east of the settlement. Moss read it, then read it again. The rebellion was not 3 southern packs testing boundaries. It was not a coordinated but manageable resistance. The network stretched across 8 territories. The supply lines ran deeper and older than anything Bianca's journals had traced. And the target was not a border dispute or a trade grievance. It was the North itself. He stood in the thin morning light with the message in his hand and understood, with the cold clarity of someone who had just learned that the war he had prepared for was considerably larger than the war that was coming. He left before dawn. No ceremony. No formal departure address to the settlement. His riders assembled in the dark and moved out through the western pass while Frost Hollow was still sleeping, while the snow was still clean and unbroken in the blue pre-morning light. Bianca watched from her doorway until the last horse disappeared into the tree line. Then she went inside and built up the fire. 4 royal riders remained. She had met them briefly the evening before Aldrich, a quiet man from the Eastern Territories who listened more than he spoke. Petra, the only woman among them, compact and efficient and direct. Twin brothers named Cade and Corvin, who communicated largely through a system of glances that seemed to require no translation. All 4 were competent. All 4 were strangers to the territory, the people, the land. They reported to her each morning at the cabin. That had been Moss's arrangement, stated simply to both parties before he left, in a tone that did not invite renegotiation. The first morning, all 4 of them stood in her doorway with the carefully neutral expressions of people who had been told to take their orders from someone they weren't certain they were supposed to respect. She handed them each a map she had prepared overnight. After that, the expressions adjusted. The settlement came to her in pieces. Not all at once, that was not how people moved when they were revising a long-held assumption. They came individually, at odd hours, with the slightly sideways approach of those who had not yet decided whether they were doing something reasonable or something embarrassing. Bram came first. He appeared at her door on the 3rd morning with his arms crossed and his jaw set, wearing the expression of a man enduring necessary medicine. He stood on her step for a full 10 seconds without speaking, which she allowed, and then said, "The storage house, the eastern wall. I want to know if it'll hold another storm before we repair the roof section." Bianca looked at him. "Come back in an hour," she said. "I'll have the assessment." He came back in an hour. She gave him the assessment, specific, detailed, prioritized by urgency, and he took it without comment. He was almost to the path when he stopped and stood still for a moment with his back to her. "The flowers," he said, not loudly. I shouldn't have said what I said about them. It was not eloquent. It was not graceful. It was the apology of a man who had decided that the debt existed and ought to be acknowledged, and had done the acknowledging in the bluntest possible way because he didn't trust himself with anything more delicate. "I know," she said. He walked away, but he came back the following day with a question about the northern fence line, and the day after that with one about the grain store drainage. The quality of his presence changed each time. Less armored, less sideways. Elder Tessa arrived on the 5th day, carrying soup. She said nothing explanatory about it, simply appeared at the door in the early afternoon with a clay pot and an expression of determined ordinaries, as though this was something she had always done. They ate together in the small cabin without speaking very much, and at the end of it Tessa looked around at the journals and the maps and the drying herbs and the careful records of 3 years' quiet observation, and said, with the plainness of a woman making a formal acknowledgement, "I should have listened to you." Bianca poured more tea. "You can listen now," she said. Tessa did. The children came without invitation and without occasion, the way children went places because something had caught their attention, and the most direct route to it ran straight through any social obstacle in the way. They appeared at the edges of her clearing first, watching from a distance with the frank assessment of the very young, then closer, then sitting on her step, then inside, looking at the herb bundles, asking questions. She answered with the same directness she gave everyone. The pack builders came with rolled sketches and structural problems, hesitant at first, then less so when they discovered she engaged not with the authority of someone proving a point, but simply with the practicality of someone who had thought carefully about the same materials they were working with. Frost Hollow did not transform. Transformations were dramatic, sudden, obvious. This was something quieter, a slow reorientation, like a field of frost, slowly angling toward a light source. It had taken too long to notice. She became, without ceremony or announcement, the person people went to when they needed to think something through. The cabin at the edge of the territory, which had been assigned as exile, became instead a kind of quiet center. Bianca noted the change the way she noted everything, observed it, recorded it, did not entirely trust it, because something else was happening at the edges. Unknown tracks appeared in the snow near the northern tree line, not wolf, not deer, shaped wrong for anything wild. Gone by mid-morning, but she had risen early enough to sketch them twice. Missing livestock from the Fenner farm, 2 animals, no trail, no blood, no evidence of predation. Small things, easy to dismiss individually. She did not dismiss them. And then Aldrich found the cache. He brought it to her on the 8th morning, a flat metal case, small enough to conceal in a coat pocket, discovered beneath a loose foundation stone in the abandoned mill at the settlement's northern edge. Inside, 6 small squares of birch bark, marked with a cipher that was not standard northern script. Bianca sat with them for 2 hours. She had seen 2 of the symbols before in the margins of a trade ledger she'd found discarded behind the storage house 7 months ago, and kept because something about it had seemed deliberately ordinary. She retrieved the ledger now, set it beside the bark squares, and began working from the overlap outward. By afternoon she had the shape of it. "It's a reporting system," she told Aldrich and Petra, who had waited with the particular patience of people who had learned that patience was worth it. "Each square is a status update. Movement counts, timing, confirmation of received instructions." She set down the piece she'd decoded last. "Someone here has been marking patrol schedules. Supply timing, entry and exit patterns." She paused. "This one is dated 4 days ago." Aldrich looked at it, after Raff was suspended. Yes. The word landed in the room like a stone in water. Raff was confined, watched. He had not sent so much as a letter since his suspension. Moss's riders had confirmed it, which meant the cache did not belong to Raff. It belonged to someone else. The messenger arrived from the south on the 10th day, riding hard despite the cold, his horse lathered and his face tight, with the urgency of someone carrying news that had not improved during the journey. He carried a sealed communication from Moss's field commander. Bianca broke the seal alongside Petra and read it twice. The southern campaign had encountered resistance at the Varath border, resistance that had known exactly which route Moss's riders were taking, which supply points they were using, which allied packs were prepared to receive them. The commander's message was precise and alarmed in equal measure. "The enemy has advanced knowledge of our movements. The intelligence is current, not historical. Someone with access to the king's operational plans is communicating outward. We cannot identify the source. Advise with urgency." Bianca set the message down on the table beside the decoded bark squares. 4 days ago. After Raff. She looked at the symbols again, the careful, systematic record of a settlement's rhythms, compiled by someone who had lived inside them long enough to make them invisible. Someone patient. Someone ignored. Someone, she understood with a cold and settling certainty, who had learned exactly the same lesson she had, that the best place to hide was in plain sight, among people who had already decided you didn't matter. The South was nothing like the North. Moss had known this intellectually, the way you knew things you had been told before you had seen them. But riding into the Varath territories with 40 riders and the weight of an unfolding war on his flanks made the difference physical and immediate. The air was different. The light was different. The land itself had a different texture, rolling and open, where the north was vertical and close, offering sightlines that cut both ways. You could see further south, which meant you could also be seen. He had been in the field for 12 days when he first heard the name. Magnus. It came from a captured courier, a young man who gave it up under questioning with the resigned air of someone who had already understood that the cause he'd been carrying messages for was wider than he'd been told. Magnus of the Southern Vareth Pack, former military commander under the previous council before the restructuring. Methodical, patient, a man who, according to the courier's pale and careful account, had spent 7 years building something that was designed specifically not to look like what it was until it was ready. It was ready. The network stretched across 8 pack territories. Moss had known that from the intercepted message. What he had not known, until the courier spoke, was the shape of it. Magnus did not want to defeat the North. Defeat was temporary. Magnus wanted to divide it, to fracture the northern territories along the old boundary lines that predated the current alliance, returning each territory to isolated governance, removing the unified structure that made the North powerful enough to resist southern expansion. Not a war, a dissolution. Moss sent the information north by rider that same evening. He received Bianca's first response 4 days later. She sent it through Aldrich. In her characteristically unornamented style, 3 pages of tight, careful notation, cross-referenced against the decoded cache materials, identifying supply movement patterns that matched known routes through the Vareth territories. She had found 2 additional coded communications in the interim, retrieved by Petra from a second cache near the mill. These she had also decoded. The information they contained was operational, rather than logistical timing sequences, confirmation signals, a rendezvous marker she had recognized from her earlier terrain sketches. She had marked the location on a map. Moss looked at it for a long time. Then he changed his route. His field commander, Sir Devin, reviewed the adjustment with the carefully worded skepticism of an experienced soldier being asked to redirect a campaign based on intelligence from a source he had never met. Moss let him finish. Then he said, "She predicted a snowstorm from route behavior and decoded a military cipher from trade ledger margins. Adjust the route." Devon adjusted the route. The position they would have ridden through a narrow valley passage 2 days east was occupied when Moss's advance scouts reached it. 40 rebel fighters holding the high ground on both sides. A clean ambush, designed for exactly the column formation Moss had been using before the route change. Devon did not raise the question of the source's credibility again. Back in Frost Hollow, Bianca found the second traitor on a Thursday. She had been tracking him for 6 days without knowing she was tracking him, following the same method she applied to everything, which was to notice what didn't fit and return to it until the wrongness resolved into a shape. What didn't fit was Caleb. The settlement's trademaster was a middle-aged man of unremarkable appearance and careful manners, who had managed Frost Hollow's supply relationships for 11 years with the quiet competence that made people forget to notice him. He attended the morning assessments Bianca had been holding with the 4 riders. He offered occasional observations about supply timings. He brought the records she requested when she requested them. He brought them slightly too quickly. She had first noticed it on the 4th day, a supply ledger she had asked for, that he produced from inside his coat, rather than from the records room. As though he had known she would want it before she'd asked, she filed the observation and said nothing. She asked for 3 more records over the following 2 days, making the requests casually, at different times, to different people. Caleb produced 2 of them before they had technically been relayed to him. On Thursday morning, she asked Aldrich, quietly, to check the path between Caleb's house and the mill during the early watch. Aldrich found him at the second cache site, replacing a message. The questioning was conducted in the gathering hall, as Raff's had been, but Caleb did not construct defenses the way Raff had. Raff had been a man protecting an investment. Caleb, when Aldrich sat him down across from Bianca and Petra, looked instead like a man who had been holding something heavy for too long and had simply run out of the endurance required to keep holding it. He talked for 2 hours. Raff had recruited him 3 years ago, the same period during which Bianca had been assigned to the western boundary. a timing she noted without interrupting the account. Caleb's role had been practical and contained. Adjust supply records incrementally, reroute specific deliveries, ensure that certain information about the settlement's resource levels and patrol patterns reach the southern network through the coded cache system. He had not known, he said, about Magnus. He had not known the scope. Bianca believed the first. She was less certain of the second. What mattered was the documentation. Caleb provided it willingly. Names, dates, delivery records, the full correspondence he had kept in a locked box beneath the floorboards of the records room, with the particular hoarding instinct of a man who understood that evidence could be either a weapon or a shield, depending on which direction. The situation eventually moved. She sent everything south by rider within the hour. The network, deprived of its 2 remaining functioning nodes in Frost Hollow, went quiet. The cache sites produced nothing new. The unknown tracks near the tree line stopped appearing. Whatever system had been operating inside the settlement for 3 years had lost its mechanism, and the silence that followed had the distinct quality of something structural that had finally given way. Moss received the Caleb intelligence on the eve of what his commanders had identified as the campaign's decisive engagement. Magnus had consolidated his remaining forces at a fortified position in the lowland pass, the last viable stronghold before the fractured network collapsed entirely under its own exposed weight. Bianca's decoded materials had traced 3 of Magnus's remaining supply lines. 2 were severed. The third ran through a narrow eastern approach that the rebel forces had been using as a secondary withdrawal route, keeping it deliberately underdefended to preserve its function. Moss planned the assault around it. He rode at dawn with his full column. The eastern approach sealed behind the rebel position by 20 riders under Devon's command. The main assault moving in from the north with the terrain advantage Bianca's maps had identified a week before they'd reached the area. Clean, calculated, the kind of engagement that ended things. He was 300 meters from the fortified position when the eastern force's signal horn sounded. Wrong pattern. Not the signal for a sealed route. The signal for contact. He turned his horse. The eastern approached the underdefended route, the one Bianca's intelligence had identified. The one Moss had built half his assault around erupted with riders. Not fleeing. Not withdrawing. Attacking. They had known. Somehow. Through whatever remained of the network. Through whatever thread had not been severed. Magnus had known. The ambush closed around Moss's column from 2 sides with the practiced, methodical efficiency of a plan that had been waiting for exactly this moment. 3 weeks passed without word. Then 4. Bianca continued her morning assessments with Aldrich and Petra. She continued her weather records. She continued the structural consultations, the herb preparations, the quiet work of a settlement, slowly learning to repair itself. She did all of this with the same steady economy she brought to everything, and she did not speak about the silence from the south, because speaking about it would not change it and would cost her something she preferred to keep. But she noticed when the fire burned lower than she'd built it. She noticed when she woke before dawn and lay still in the dark for longer than was necessary. She noticed the way her eyes moved to the eastern pass each morning before she'd consciously decided to look. She noticed. She recorded nothing. Some observations were not for journals. In the absence of news, she worked. The northern row of houses had sustained the worst damage from the Storm 3, requiring significant structural repair. 2 needing full roof reconstruction before the next heavy snowfall made them uninhabitable. She had drafted the repair sequence in order of urgency within days of the storm. Now, with Caleb's confiscated records providing a clearer picture of the settlement's actual supply inventory, she could match materials to projects in ways the settlement's previous management had never bothered to calculate. The builders consulted her daily. She showed them the drainage modifications that would prevent the eastern foundations from heaving again in the spring thaw. She showed them where the windbreak plantings needed to be extended, which materials would hold heat best in the older structures, how to angle the new storage roof to shed load rather than accumulate it. They listened. They implemented. The work went faster than it had in years. Bram became, quietly and without fanfare, something resembling useful. He had physical authority in the settlement that she did not. People moved when Bram directed them, organized into work groups without the friction of skepticism. He brought her the problems. She gave him the solutions. He deployed them. Neither of them discussed the arrangement. It simply became the arrangement. Elder Tessa formalized nothing but changed everything. She began including Bianca in the elder consultations, not by announcement, not by official designation, but by the simple act of sending a runner to the western cabin when matters were being discussed that warranted her attention. The first time Bianca walked into the gathering hall and took a seat at the table and was not asked to explain her presence, she noted the moment carefully in the private part of herself that kept track of such things. The children arrived in greater numbers as the weeks passed. 3 of them had begun helping her tend the rose bushes, learning to read the frozen stems the way she had first learned to read them with their hands rather than their eyes, feeling for the resistance that meant roots still holding, life still present beneath the apparent death of the surface. She taught them what her grandmother had taught her. Not all of it, but the beginning of it. Frost Hollow did not become a different place. It remained what it had always been, a cold settlement at the edge of difficult territory, managing the ordinary hardships of northern life with the practical stubbornness of people who had chosen to stay somewhere that regularly tested that choice. But it functioned differently now, more honestly, with the particular efficiency of a community that had stopped wasting the resources it actually had. Bianca understood, somewhere in the 5th week, that the settlement had stopped functioning despite her and started functioning around her. She was not certain what to do with the understanding, so she did what she always did with complicated things. She noted it. She watched. She waited. The riders appeared on a grey morning in the 6th week. She saw them from the window before anyone else did, a column moving through the eastern pass, larger than a messenger's party, too steady in formation to be carrying bad news. Bad news rode urgently. Good news, in her experience, moved like this, with the particular relieved efficiency of people who had survived something and were returning to prove it. She was standing outside when they reached the settlement. She was not watching the column. She was checking the rose bushes along the northern face, pressing her fingers to the stems the way she did each morning, feeling the slow changes in the root tension that told her the season's direction. The ice was beginning to loosen, very slightly, barely perceptible, but she had been paying attention to these roots for 3 years, and she could feel the difference. She heard the settlement respond behind her before she turned. The sound was specific, not the scramble and panic of the storm night, not the forced efficiency of Raf's departure, but something simpler, the uncomplicated sound of people who had been waiting and had now, without warning, stopped. She turned. He was at the settlement's edge, dismounted, speaking in low exchanges with Devin and Aldrich, while the rest of the column organized itself behind him, snow on his shoulders, as before, ice in his dark hair. He looked like a man who had been in the field for 6 weeks and had not spent any of that time on comfort, and he moved with the particular stillness of someone who had used up a great deal and had not yet decided what came next. His silver eyes found her across the distance. He walked toward her without haste. She stayed where she was. He stopped a few feet away and looked past her, first at the cabin, at the roses, at the settlement behind her that was already visibly different from the one he had left, the repaired northern row, the new drainage channels, the expanded storage roof. The children who had stopped their morning tasks to watch his arrival, with the frank curiosity of the very young, clustered near Bianca's step, as though it was simply where they gathered now. He looked at all of it, then at her. She watched him understand, in the quiet and precise way that people understood things they had not anticipated, that what she had done in his absence was not maintenance, not management, not the careful execution of instructions left behind by someone with actual authority. She had rebuilt something, and then she had changed it. The silence between them had none of the wariness of their first meeting. It had the different quality of a silence between 2 people who had covered enough ground together that the quiet no longer required filling. "Magnus," she said, "captured. Raf is fully exposed. Caleb's records sealed the network's collapse." A pause. "It's done." She nodded once, the way she had nodded at the dying roses 6 weeks ago, in a different version of this morning. "Good." He looked at the settlement again, at the children watching from her doorstep. at Bram, who had stopped mid-direction, to observe the return with an expression that held, for the first time in Bianca's memory of him, something close to honest reassessment. At Elder Tessa, standing in the gathering hall doorway with her hands folded and her eyes moving between Moss and the woman he had walked directly to upon arriving. When his gaze returned to Bianca, it carried something different than before. Not the focused attention of a king reading useful intelligence. Something quieter than that, more careful. "What do you want, Bianca?" he asked. She looked at him. He didn't clarify the question. He seemed to have meant it at full width, all of it, whatever it reached. She had not been asked that. Not once. Not by anyone. Spring did not arrive dramatically. It never did, this far north. It came the way most honest things came, gradually, without announcement, in small increments that required attention to notice. The ice on the eastern water trough thinned before it disappeared. The light through the cabin window shifted its angle by a degree, then two. The ravens returned to the northern ridge. The air, which had held the particular sealed quality of deep winter for months, began to carry something underneath it. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the memory of warmth, the suggestion of it. Bianca noticed it first in the roses. 6 weeks after Moss's return, she pressed her fingers to the base of the nearest stem and felt what she had been waiting for since the storm. A faint, almost imperceptible change in the root tension, the underground shift of something that had survived and was beginning, very quietly, to say so. She crouched in the half-frozen earth and looked closely at the soil around the northern face, and there they were, green shoots, small as a thumbnail, pale and determined, pushing through the frost-hardened ground with the absolute indifference of things that had decided to continue. She sat back on her heels and looked at them for a long time. Life had a way of surviving things people assumed had killed it. She had known this about roots since she was a child, had understood it in the abstract for years, had staked her grandmother's teachings on it every winter, but there was something different about seeing it on a morning in March. In the ground she had worked with her own hands, after the hardest winter Frost Hollow had experienced in a decade. She was still crouching there when she heard the horse. He had been coming once a fortnight since the campaign ended. It had begun practically matters requiring her consultation, the ongoing investigation into the rebel network's remnants, the documentation process for transferring her journal's intelligence into the Northern Archives. There was always a reason, always something specific and legitimate in the leather satchel he carried across the saddle. But he stayed longer than the reason required. They had not spoken about this directly. Bianca had noticed it the way she noticed everything carefully, without rushing the observation toward a conclusion it hadn't yet earned. She had learned too much about the cost of misreading things to interpret what wasn't yet fully legible. So she noted it. She watched it develop the way she watched seasons develop, with patience and without projection, letting it become what it was going to become in its own time. What it was becoming, she thought, was something real. Not the mate bond that the Pack's tradition placed so much weight on that automatic, fated claiming that had always struck her as a convenient excuse to stop asking whether you actually chose the person. Not circumstance or proximity or gratitude. What was growing between them had the quality of things that developed slowly, the kind that put down roots before they showed above the surface, built from long evenings by the fire, from letters that had begun as operational and gradually become something else, from the way he asked her questions and then actually waited for the answers, from the way she had begun, almost without deciding to trust that his attention was genuine. It was enough. More than enough. It was the first thing in a very long time that felt like it belonged to her. The formal recognition had come in late winter. The council convened at Moss's direction, and Bianca's journals, all 14 of them, covering 3 years of weather, wildlife, structural observation, and intelligence documentation, were formally received into the Northern Archives as primary source materials. Elder Tessa delivered the acknowledgement herself, standing in the gathering hall where she had once allowed Bianca to be thanked for her enthusiasm and directed toward mending. She spoke plainly. She said she had been wrong. She did not ornament it or explain it away. Bianca received it the same way she had received the apology in Bram's crossed arms and the soup on her doorstep, and every other quiet correction this community had been making, one small, honest gesture at a time. She thanked the council. She meant it. Frost Hollow received its new leadership formally in the same session. Bram was appointed interim beta pending the full council review. He had not sought it. He accepted it with the manner of a man who had been given responsibility he now understood the weight of. Construction on the cabin had begun in early spring, not demolishing what she had built, but extending it a second room to the east for the research and archive work, a small treatment space for the healing consultations that had grown steadily since winter. The builders worked from her own sketches, modified with her input each morning, and they built it well. She watched it taking shape from the doorway and felt something she did not immediately have a name for, which she eventually identified as permanence, the uncomplicated sense of a thing that was going to last. He came on a Tuesday, which was not his usual day. She was standing among the roses when he arrived, her hands at her sides, looking at the green shoots that had multiplied now into a low, determined spread along the entire northern and western faces. Not yet blooming, but coming the slow certainty of it, visible in every inch of new growth pushing through the dark soil. She heard him dismount and come to stand beside her. For a while, neither of them spoke. The morning was clear and very still, the kind of early spring morning that existed briefly before the seasonal wind established itself, when the air was simply present without agenda. The mountains beyond the settlement's edge were beginning to show their slopes again beneath the retreating snowline. The sky was the pale, luminous blue of a world considering warmth. "Do you regret it?" he asked eventually. "Staying here?" She looked at the shoots, at the slow, deliberate return of something everyone else had assumed was finished. "No," she said. She was quiet for a moment. He didn't fill it. "I simply refused to leave my roots." He turned to look at her. She met his gaze with the same directness she had turned on him that first morning in her doorway. No performance, no deflection, just the plain and uncomplicated truth of a person who had stopped apologizing for taking up space. Something shifted in his expression. Unhurried. Certain. "Good," he said. "A pause, because I intend to keep returning." She looked back at the roses. Along the base of the northernmost bush, the first blossom was beginning to open, small, dark, improbable against the frozen earth that still clung to the shadows under the cabin wall. Not fully open, but opening, the way things opened when they had survived long enough to be certain the season had actually changed. They stood together in the morning light and watched it. Two people who had found each other in the worst storm in a decade, who had built something not from fate or declaration, but from attention, from trust, from the quiet and radical act of asking and answering honestly. The storm had ended, the roots had held, and in the cold, dark earth beneath the black roses, life was doing what life had always done, quietly, stubbornly, without asking anyone's permission. Blooming again. And if you enjoyed the story, let me know in the comments. Your voice decides what I write next. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more moonlit love stories like this one.